Well, hello there everybody. I am back again. I have the 2007 Rhino 450 made by Yamaha. Nothing but the best, in my opinion, of course. But basically what we got going on today, we need to replace the brake pads in the rear and the rotor. Customer supplied rotor and brake pads to replace. So we're going to run through basically what we have to do. First we're going to wind up taking off both tires. I did jack it up already. I have it on jack stands. We're going to take off both tires, the axles, everything's got to come apart so that we can move the rear differential to get, let me switch. We're going to have to get the rear differential out of there to get to the prop shaft here where the disc rotor is on and the brake pads and the rear caliper. So we're going to start, as I said, by removing both of the rear tires. We're going to take off what we need to get the axles out, remove them, take the differential off, and then we're going to get to taking this shaft off. I'm going to show you how to do that. So I pulled off both rear tires, kind of cleaned this whole area and this whole area pretty good. I just blew it off with the air hose, sprayed some brake cleaner around here just to help break up some of the debris, mud and everything that was caked to it. So what we're going to want to do is take off the axle nuts. This is a 32 millimeter nut. So take off the axle nuts and we're going to slide the hub off. And then what we're going to do is on the upper side, we're going to take off this nut and bolt where this grease fitting goes through. And we're going to remove that bolt, and then we're going to swing this whole hub assembly out as we pull the axle out, and then we're gonna just pull, kind of give a good tug on the axles and pop the axles out. Once you do that on both sides, this will be basically all we need to do here, and then we'll get to the differential and we'll take all the hardware off that we need on the differential for where the mounts are, and remove the caliper that's on the disc rotor, and we'll pop off the shaft. So once you get the axle nut off, which the axle nut does have a spot on there that you have to peen over that sits into this little crevice of the axle, okay? So you might have to try to punch that out of the way a little bit. You might not have to. I mean, my gun was powerful enough to, get it off itself without having to do that. So once you get the axle nut off, I already took off the nut here for this mount. Basically the hub should just slip right off, okay? So you take that off. You notice inside here there is a little O-ring, okay? So we want to make sure that we get that O-ring off and back in place when we put it back together. And if necessary, you could use a little flathead screwdriver or something to get it off, just so it doesn't go flying and you don't lose it, because that's important to help seal everything off in there. Just gonna place that down and take off this upper bolt. Should hopefully just pop right off, because the bushings and everything does get greased with that grease fitting. And then if necessary, if for some reason it's seized up a little bit in here, there's nothing wrong with taking a rubber dead blow mallet and smacking the axle if needed. Okay, so pop that off. You basically just let that hang there. So now you have your axle, and we got to remove the axles. And as I said, you just kind of give it a little push in and then pop out. I'm not going to do it right this second, because Yamaha's rear end differentials and front, the axles are actually in the differential where they are getting soaked in oil. So if you pull the axles out, there's a good chance that oil is going to come out. So you want to make sure you have a oil pan underneath it. So I got to get my oil pan underneath, pop the axles out. I'm going to be changing the fluid in the rear end anyhow, so it only makes sense to drain it first before pulling the axles out, just so it makes less of a mess. But it's just a point of advice. If you're have no intentions of replacing or changing the oil in the differential, you know, you're probably gonna have to top it off if you lose some oil, but put a pan underneath it so that it drips into the pan. Pop the axles off, and then we'll get the caliper off and we will proceed with removing the differential. And just so you're aware of draining the differential, you see that little bolt right there? It is a 12 millimeter bolt right on the bottom of the differential. That is your drain. This is your fill. So we're going to pull that bottom bolt out. We're going to drain the differential, and then we're going to pull the axles. And just so you can see how to remove the axle, as I mentioned, you kind of want to push in a little bit and pull it out, and it should pop right out. And as you can see, it's full of oil all over it because this whole assembly is soaked on the internal parts of the differential, which typically, and in most cases almost always, makes it very easy to remove these axles from these Yamahas. There are definitely a lot of brands out there, some other brands that might begin with the letter P, that do not have this feature of the axles being soaked in there, and they get corroded and they get stuck and you can't get the axles out, and you run into some major issues with some other brands removing axles. And that other brands do intend to have a lot of axle failures, which Yamaha typically does not. For some particular reason, Yamaha axles are made real well, I guess. And being that they're soaked in oil, when it's time for maintenance, it's really relatively simple to take apart. You know, but you can see also, as I mentioned, how wet it is in there. You can see the little drips that came out. It's still draining, of course, but you can see the little drips that came out. So, you know, there's going to be oil that comes out of there. So be sure to have a drain pan underneath it so you don't get oil all over the place. So I'm going to continue to let that drip for a little bit. Put the drain plug back in it. Just kind of clean up, you know, this oil mess and stuff. I'm going to wipe it down. And then we're going to start to remove the hardware. And you're only going to remove the bolts that are where the mounting is, okay? We're not going to remove these bolts that are on the cover of the differential. We're just going to remove the mounting bolts there, the mounting bolt in the front right there, okay? We're only going to remove the mounting bolts to remove the differential as well as the brake caliper. Now, of course, because the pads are so worn on this, the parking brake also does not work very well. It's probably never been adjusted since the pads have been, you know, worn down. So we may not have to adjust the parking brake cable. We'll get to that after if needed. But for now, the mounting bolts for your caliper to remove are right here. And it's going to be tough to see, but it's down here, okay? It's the same size and same style bolt as that. It's a 14 millimeter. And the other one is down here. I know it's difficult to see. I apologize for that, but if you look right in between this little V here, basically, that's where the other bolt is. So we're going to pull those two bolts off, remove that parking brake and brake caliper assembly right off of the differential and off of the rotor, and then we'll take the rest of the differential off. So we got the two bolts off of the rear caliper assembly. One thing you might want to do is just swing it out of the way and get a little bit more free play in there. These mounts that hold the cables, you're going to want to squeeze these and push these through. This one kind of only half of it folded, but they have little tabs on it. You're going to want to squeeze these, and squeeze these tabs and try to push these through. That one's being a little stubborn. Just to get some free play of the cables and some more range to be able to move the caliper out of the way and to replace the pads in it, do what needs to be done. I might need both hands for this just to make it a little easier, but you're going to want to move these. And on the back side right here, there's a couple more. Looks like someone's actually got a zip tie on this one, so the original tie probably broke at some point or something, so just cut the zip tie to be able to get the caliper out and out of the way. So if you can see, we got both of the mounting bolts off. And then the next step is going to be to pull this back, because this right here is where the shaft is going to come off the differential. Okay, so those two bolts on the upper side, and that's all it is, just two bolts, two long bolts. There is washers on the bolt and the nut side, so make sure when you take off the nut, you take off the little washer so you don't drop it, lose it, anything like that. There'll be one on the bolt side too when you pull the bolt out. So bolt, washer, washer, nut. Both sides, top, front and rear of the differential. Then pull back this rubber boot, and then you're going to want to just basically take the differential and wiggle it and pull it back and hold on to that shaft and try to separate the shaft from the differential for where it goes to the brake assembly. So you can see we've moved the differential back enough to separate it from the prop shaft there. Now, one thing to keep an eye out on the inside of that shaft. Okay, there's a little hole inside the shaft, and this little rubber piece is a little damper. This nipple end is going to go inside that shaft, and this is a damper to, you know, help with vibration and noise in the prop shaft that goes into the differential. So don't lose it. Make sure it goes back in towards the front of the machine where the nipple is. Okay, and our next step, now that we've loosened that up, is to take off all of the 8mm bolts on this skid plate, and we're going to take the differential off out of the bottom of the machine. And there it is, the differential is out. The way you want to remove this, basically just take your time with it. Kind of push the caliper out of the way, you know, grab the brake caliper and kind of push it up a little bit out of the way, and you're going to want to drop the front end down first and just pull it out. I mean, it comes out relatively easy. So you can see that little spot that I mentioned where that damper goes, and that damper just simply goes right in that hole. Okay, I keep it out until I'm ready to put it back in, because I don't want it to fall out and not notice. So we're gonna take off. So you got the bolts here with the nuts. I'm gonna pull the rotor, put a new rotor on. We're gonna put new pads in. As you can see, the pads are gonzo. Look how far that piston is sticking out. So we're gonna replace the pads. We're gonna do the rotor. We're also gonna be doing a complete brake flush on this machine. Just to, you know, bleed it. So I have a vacuum bleeder. It's going to be the best way. Just hook it up to the calipers, bleed all the brake fluid. We're going to put fresh fluid in this machine because I'm sure it's never been done since 2007. So being that it's all new pads, new rotors all around in this machine, we're going to flush the entire brake system. Alright, so we got the rotor back on. The only other thing we're going to want to do is clean that rotor with brake cleaner, because it does have cosmoline or some type of shipping material to keep it from rusting. We're going to want to clean that up so that doesn't get on the brakes, on the brake pads when we put them in. See those two little pins right there with that 5mm Allen? Those go right here to hold the brake pads in. Okay, so you got to take those two pins out to take the brake pads out, which you can see how terrible these brake pads are. I mean, there's no pad left, and it's gone about 1/3 of the way through the metal backing of the pads. So it was definitely very bad. When you turn the piston on this thing to close it up, you can see there's crosshairs there. You need to physically turn it clockwise and just turn it until it's all the way seated in. This one I don't think was ever adjusted parking brake wise. If it was adjusted, there could be a possibility that you might not be able to turn it all the way in because the cable's pulling too tight on it, whatever the case may be. But you have to turn that in corkscrew style, piston inside here. It's not just a press style like you would on the front calipers of this or on a conventional caliper. It is a corkscrew style because it does have the parking brake attached to it. So just turn that in. I used just a big, huge flat head that I used, and just turned it in till it's seated. Pulled the bracket off here, and I lubricated the pins. Another thing I will do is clean these up, and I'll lubricate these pins just a little bit, not a lot, but just a little bit, to keep them from seizing up. And that's basically it. I'm going to install the new pads now. I'm going to clean that rotor with brake cleaner and start the install process. Basically, I'm not going to run through the install process too much, if any, just because, you know, all you got to do is reverse the steps of how you took it apart. So if you knew how to take it apart and got this far, then you know how to put it back together. So that will be the last steps I do right now, basically, before reinstallation, is cleaning those two pins, putting the new brake pads on, cleaning that rotor, and then we reinstall everything. As I mentioned before, make sure that that little rubber damper goes into that prop shaft, and that's basically it. Make sure you put oil back in the rear gear case, and make sure that everything you put back together is tightened properly. You know, always a good point, of course, to make sure you grease the grease fittings when you put everything back together so it's nice and lubricated, and you should be golden. So no further instructions needed. If you do have any questions, please comment below, let me know. Hopefully this helped somebody. Hopefully you enjoyed watching the video, and we'll see you next time. Thank you very much. Please hit that like button, please hit that subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications, because I will be putting videos up as often as possible. And hopefully it's something that helps you with something you're doing. Maybe it'll help you understand how something is done, or why, when you bring something like this to a technician or a dealership or wherever, why it costs so much money, why it takes a couple hours. Well, you can see I had to take the whole rear end of this machine apart to replace the disc rotor on the rear brake. So you know, when you put everything back together, like I said, just make sure everything's tight. You're going to want to double check your parking brake cable to make sure it's adjusted properly, and that's basically it. So thank you again very much, and we will see you on the next one.